Hello, I'm Jo Fuller and I'd like to ask the members of our panel to introduce themselves.
My name's Jessica Varela.
I'm Michael Maxwell.
Hi, I'm Shanella Falzon.
I'm Liam Dooley.
Hi, I'm Jules Jasper-Zalaus.
Thanks. I'd like to start by acknowledging we're on what always was and always will be Aboriginal land. We pay our respects to Elders past, present and emerging, and we thank the traditional owners for their custodianship of the land. These panel discussions follow on from our Courageous Conversations series of modules. It's an opportunity for us to explore in more depth some of the issues that were raised during those sessions. Please be aware, though, that some of the material that we talk about might be triggering or confronting, so please look after yourself during these sessions. This panel discussion is called Breaking Free. We're going to explore the impact of trauma and intersectionality. It's a deeper dive into the barriers that women face in leaving violent relationships and how to be an effective bystander. So I want to begin our conversation today with a short clip.
Our members work at the coalface and we see how few women actually have choices. So they don't have choices because they're threatened that if they do leave, they will be murdered, their children will be murdered, they're threatened that their animals will be beaten, often they are, tortured, they threaten that embarrassing photographs will be, put on the internet, a range of different things. And also, it's really difficult for women to leave because there are so few options. We're seeing, it used to be that women went into refuge for short periods of time and then they were exited into rental properties or social housing. Affordable accommodation is so rare that we can no longer exit women, and so there's a bottlenecking of even getting women into refuge. So they and their children are holed up in hotels. They can't cook for children. There's nowhere for kids to play, and so many times women have to return to violent circumstances because they get a glimpse into their future, which is long-term chronic poverty, homelessness, and poverty. So,
So Fiona touches on a number of things that stop women from leaving, including violent relationships, I should say, including homelessness and poverty. And we know that's just the tip of the iceberg. So let's talk about that and some of the barriers that women face in leaving, and then in particular the dynamics of abusive relationships that impact on the woman. So let's talk about the cycle of violence. Jules?
So the cycle of violence, I think, is unique for every relationship is different and every person's experience in violence is very unique. So I just want to acknowledge that for those that are watching the video that have experienced violence. But the pattern, I guess, of violence and the way in which it cycles is not so unique. And it tends to happen in a pattern, and it may feel different to each person, but we know that it kind of is a cycle. And I guess the first signs is the build-up. And so often women are sitting there just waiting on eggshells. They're just sitting, waiting to see what's going to happen next. When's it going to happen? They'll hear a door slam or a car door slam and they think, okay, this is it. It's building up. He's getting angrier or it's happening. There's often standover tactics or standover. So there'll be potential for the partner to be just stopping them from doing certain things, or intimidation methods, or questioning them when they come home. And so all these opportunities for the partner to be just standing over the top of the woman. And then there will be a point in time. So the build-up happens, the standing over happens, and then there's an explosion. And so that explosion is different for each person, but there is that incident and that moment where the violence explodes in the family home. And then after that happens, then there's often remorse. And so the perpetrator feels guilt, is apologetic, tells them how much they love them, how sorry they are, that it'll never happen again, that they didn't mean it, that they'll do better. And so there's often a lot of promises that happen at that stage. And then often we move into the honeymoon stage. And so that's where, and that period of time is different for each person, but often it's where everyone takes a breath. And it can be the moment where for women and for children, it's that lure into that false sense of security. So it's the moment where you think, oh, it's going to be different this time, and he really did mean it, and you feel that maybe it's going to be okay this time, and then something changes, and you start to move back to stage one, and so it's kind of this cycle that goes, and it's not as clear cut, it's not perfect, but that's the understanding of the cycle of violence.
Absolutely.
The violence may or may not escalate over time. It might be the same level of control, or it may get worse and worse. It just depends on each relationship. But it is a systemic thing, isn't it? And it's all encompassing, and it's there to kind of build a sense of fear in the woman. So the perpetrator, who's usually male, has a sense of power and control over them.
And we've seen in a previous session how women often feel guilt or they take on the responsibility for the violence. So I think sometimes what stops a woman from leaving is thinking that somehow she's contributed to it.
Yep.
Somehow it's her responsibility to make it stop. Or maybe she just believes him and she really wants to believe him because she wants to believe in the fairy tale that she's been sold since she was a little girl, that, you know, marriage is the end. That's the ideal career for a woman. So that's something that we want, you know, to live happily ever after with.
There's often this constant chipping away at things as well. Like there's, you know, you're worthless. There's things like this. You're worthless. You deserve this, and you often start to believe that. And so, or you asked for it. You didn't cook my dinner correctly, or you did this. I'm doing this because you did this. And if you believe. And you start to believe those things, so you're starting to think, well, if I only do this, that won't happen. So whatever it is in your story, you start to truly believe, if I only could do this, if I was better, if I didn't do something, then this won't happen. He won't yell at me. He won't, you know, get violent with me, or he won't do this if I could only do something else.
Yeah.
And do you think that kind of thinking happens because in all of these violent relationships, whatever they may be, a woman is always trying to keep herself safe. And in some ways, if she has children, always trying to keep them safe. So one way of controlling that is to say, if I can do X, the violence will stop because that's the bit I can control. Like that's the bit I have say over. You know what I mean? Does that make sense?
But I think it's also about the victim being blamed for the
Yeah,
violence.
that's
the perpetrator's not responsible for the violence, the victim is responsible for the violence.
Yeah, that's it.
And remember that one of the tactics the perpetrators often use is to disable all of their support, so separate them from family and friends. So they become very isolated, they've got nowhere to go. And if the only images that they're seeing or the only experience that they have of, you know, relationships is fueled by this kind of myths and stereotypes that we've been talking about, then, you know, and then they see the headlines that suggest that somehow victims are responsible for men's violence, it's all going to fuel the situation where she's a bit disabled. She doesn't know what to do. She doesn't know where to go. She's disempowered. And then even if she does leave, what happens? Violence escalates.
And that's a good point, because that leads up to the barriers of why, you know, when people ask, why doesn't she leave? It's that sense of disempowerment and shame and isolation that even in the head and the heart puts that barrier down before we even talk about the structural things like housing and poverty. And I mean, in some of the cases we've seen is, you know, one of the forms of abuse is economic control. So in that relationship, the woman doesn't have access to any of the money or the assets or the finance. And so there are no means even to leave at that stage without having a big plan of how do you, you know, squirrel money away, or how do I, you know, where do you even start thinking about, you know, how you would set yourself up to move.
And in modern time, like now, you know, there's all the monitoring, there's apps on your phone, social media.
Scary.
You are so watched. You know, five years ago even you were less watched, but now every single thing that we do is monitored and watched and visible. I don't know how women can, how do you hide? How do you how do you start to protect yourself? You know, like we used to tell women to have a go bag, and when you're ready, you can go. But where do they hide anything these days? You know, like there's nowhere to put anything that's secret.
Yeah.
And so I find like they're just even more at risk now because there's just nothing.
Yeah. The apps is a scary thing. Yeah.
Which is compounded by that, where do they then go?
That's
Yeah.
right.
There's that whole bottleneck of the system.
Yeah.
Yeah.
See, the old staying home, leaving violence one that sort of favoured the woman in the house never went far enough, never quite sort of protected and supported her in the house. But why should the victim leave the house? The victim should be supported to live in her own community, her
Stay.
children stay at their school,
Yeah.
and then protected and supported financially to stay in that place.
Jess, you were going to say something?
Yeah, and for me, I think there's a couple of other things here. There's denial.
Yeah.
For domestic violence isn't, so we know it's not just physical. You've got the financial, you've got the emotional, you've got the
Psychological.
control, the psychological, you know, there's all these elements to it. So for a woman, if I'm not getting the physical, does that mean I'm not a victim of domestic violence?
Yeah.
There's the denial of, well, he hasn't hit me.
Yeah.
So does that mean, you know, like you hear the stories and you go, yeah, I don't think that's me. And it may very well be. And so there's the denial. There's also, you know, family support and even looking at the media articles, he was a top bloke. Family support. Family might say, really? We never saw that in him, you know. Oh, like, that's not my experience with him. He seems to always be this when we see him with you and the kids. They might not see what's going on. And when a woman is looking at or considering leaving, not having that support around is you know, really crucial. And then, you know, if she has children, there's also, I have to uproot my children. I have to uproot their life. I'm going to cut them off from, you know, all their activities, the school, like all their social networks, their idea of what their life is. I'm going to uproot them from that. And we're going to go and live at a refuge.
Yeah.
Nobody
So,
wants
like,
that.
it's hard. They're really hard choices. Even using the word choices, that you have choices. It's like, neither of these choices are good. So I think that we've got to be aware of that. There's this, that there's it's easier to be in that denial space. Hope for the honeymoon to come back, because if I go back into, you know, if things get good again, at least I can survive it. You know, when it's going to cycle around again, and the woman doesn't know if it's going to get worse. Or if she's just going to be able to get through again because she's just gotten through so many times. It's really hard. And it's a stupid question to ask. Why didn't she leave? Friends and family do that. Why don't you just leave? And it puts all this pressure on the woman to just have the capacity to go, I'll do it, I'll leave.
And then you've got this thing that if the kids start acting up at school, you're to blame. Why are they misbehaving at school? Why aren't you doing something about that? So then you're dealing with what you're doing, but then you're to blame for all this stuff, the flow-on effect for the upheaval. It's the mother's fault. She's to blame for what you've done because you've upheaved them from their thing. But it's like, no, I've moved them from a danger, but no, we don't name that. You've upheaved them from their security and their space, and therefore that's had an impact. So, no, what's had an impact is that they were victims of domestic violence, and I've actually protected them and I've done something. Oh, no, we don't call it that.
We don't talk about that.
We don't talk about it
We
at
don't
all.
talk about that in our family or in our social circle.
Well, not even in the school system
Yeah,
or in
the trauma.
in any of the systems. Even if you don't because you can uphear them from your own family if you want to, but we don't even talk about it in the systems. No. So the psychologist and the school counsellor and the principals and the teachers that are trained, they're not even talking about it. They're just talking about, well, why aren't you doing something about his behaviour on top of everything else you're doing?
And
why are you doing something about his behaviour?
and that's the trauma, the impact of the trauma of living with as children in a domestic violence situation. We're talking about, like, we're not even talking about the family law system and the fact that you would have to, like, go through this whole other separate process to extricate yourself from a marriage, and if there are assets in that marriage and lawyers, and that's a whole other kettle of fish that, you know, we don't even talk about, and, you know, who pays for lawyers and how that gets divvied up. That's a trauma in itself. And then custody, it's so difficult, you know, and then that simple question of why doesn't she leave, like you think about all the things that are stacked there, and you talk about children's trauma, and then you're the mum or the woman, you've experienced trauma, and then you have to look after yourself and possibly children. It's a lot, you know, and then, you know, if you have the space to deal with your own trauma and get help for your trauma, it's just it adds to that complication of how you respond and experience things.
Sorry, Shamila. No. I just wanted to get in quick before Joe jumped to something else. That I think the only other thing that you know, looking at the complexity of it, when you have mental health involved, whether it's one of the children or whether it's a perpetrator, but I think in the case of the perpetrator, when you have mental health involved, that person's unwell. And there's that responsibility is there from the partner of, you know, supporting her partner when he's unwell, but potentially that's putting her and the kids in a dangerous situation. And I'm only raising it because of, you know, trauma, this intergenerational, this where violence comes from, where and how then it plays out throughout generations. And quite often we have undiagnosed mental health issues that are also going on. We hear about victims of domestic violence. We hear about how the perpetrator had a mental health issue. And I think it also just adds to the complexity of the situation when the perpetrator's unwell.
Yeah.
Because you know, there's that responsibility of getting that person better, but, you know,
we're still
is that
putting
what's
the responsibility on the
what's
victim,
the cost?
aren't we?
Exactly.
Yeah.
You did mention something else earlier that sort of stayed back there and didn't come up again, which was that the perpetrator might act in the home differently to how they act outside the home. And that is actually quite common. So the victim of violence is actually seeing a side of someone that the family and the others don't see.
And what we also know from previous sessions is that women lie. Well, we know that they don't about this, but because it's not seen by other people, it's immediately assumed that the woman is not telling the truth.
Or is exaggerating or is not coping. Whereas the reality is there is assistance and there are people who believe you.
Or she's being dramatic.
Yeah.
Or she's being over the top.
She's got a period.
Or she's just exaggerating.
Yeah.
Because, you know, she's just being, she's just got a period, she's overreacting.
Yeah.
And he's so good, you'll never find anyone else like him.
Yeah.
So how can you like that?
And that's just
Before or
reinforcing
after,
what the perpetrator's probably also using. Anyway.
Let him go. Someone will believe you.
So we're going to go to Stacey now, who works with victims of violence, and hear what she's got to say about her experience of working with women.
Yeah, it's difficult to understand why victims stay in situations until you actually understand the dynamics of domestic violence. When there is violence in a relationship, it's very gradual and it's very subtle because batterers don't start out instantly being emotionally or physically abusive to someone. They gradually do this. So it's looking at attempts for the abuser to take control of your life, like controlling who your friends are, controlling your work schedule, controlling what you buy in a store, just controlling something, and also not taking responsibility for their behaviors. What we see is the biggest thing that allows people or leads people to stay in these relationships is fear. change is hard, so you got to look at everything it's going to take for me to go the other direction. So I have to forget and unlearn and undo and what seems to be tearing up a family to go a way that is abuse free. So it's looking at everything I have to do at one time, or the overwhelming part of everything I have to do at one time to keep moving forward and to get away from the abuse. I mean, you're talking about having to admit first that you are being abused, and that's not an easy thing to do. And then figuring out what to do to get away from it. Who you got to tell. I mean, in many cases, the isolation has taken place for so long that the victim in the situation really has no one to go to. Or families sometimes turn their back on individuals because they just don't understand what's going on.
So we know that women who experience domestic violence often display signs of trauma, and I just want to explore that a little bit, because I think sometimes people don't recognise the signs of trauma that might be being displayed. So things, Jules, you talked before about things taking you straight back to moments in your life where it just kind of resonates and takes you back in history. And I think some people don't seem to understand that trauma is not at a point in time, but it does stay with you for a long time, that you can be triggered at any point. You can regress back to that moment when you're in absolute fear and fear for your life almost.
Yeah, I think it can, it doesn't seem to matter how much work you can do on yourself, that it can overtake you at any time and any moment. And sometimes it comes out of the blue too. You could just be talking to somebody and you hear a story and it just resonates with a piece of your story or a moment in your time, and you can feel that same moment of fear or that same experience that you had, and it puts you back in that space. So when you've experienced trauma, it's not just the story. It's easy to tell the story sometimes, especially if there's been a gap in time. So you can disconnect from the story and just tell the facts of the story. But when you connect to the trauma, which is different to telling your story, it's experiencing it again. And that's different. And that's what we're talking about when we're talking about the trauma has an impact. Because that's the scars that people don't see, I think. And they're like, the way I explain it is, think of it having a bruise. And if you've got a bruise and you touch it, it hurts. And it leaves an impression, and you take your finger off and the impression goes away, but you can still feel it. That's what trauma's like. It's like having a bruise that if anybody touches it in just the right spot, in just the right moment, it hurts. And we can't always protect that bruise. So and we react sometimes in ways that are unexpected. We can you can just get sad and it can just bring up tears. But people can also get, aggressive and yell and scream because they just want to get away from that moment. They get scared and they just need to push people away and run. It's human behaviour to fight, flight, or
flight,
freeze, So they might just completely stop and not even engage with you. They might just have a cry. They might start arguing with you. These are traumatic responses sometimes. So,
and we've talked about the fact that violence, perpetrators of domestic violence are very good at tactics that destroy women's self-image, self-esteem, self-respect. It goes to the heart of who you are. It kind of calls into question who you are. So I think, associated with the trauma is that whole not quite knowing who you are, feeling guilt, feeling shame, feeling hopeless and helpless, and all those sorts of things that go along with being a victim. Yeah.
I think it's part of where the asking why doesn't she leave becomes so dangerous, because you can't possibly understand a person's situation that you're not in, and it might seem like an obvious, oh, well, you just leave, but when it has potentially been years of having your confidence, self-esteem eroded, having all of these barriers around being able to support yourself, not having support around you, it makes a lot more sense, and you can't cast judgment without actually, knowing that person's, that story.
Yeah. So let's hear from a victim of domestic violence in the next clip.
There were hints with when he started getting angry and he was getting really aggressive with me, and he pushed me to the stairs, but I guess I didn't want to believe it. I was in denial. I so badly thought I had found my fairy tale after everything I had been through in my life. I just didn't want to believe it. It's hard to leave. Often the financial is a big thing. Often the security of having a house is a big thing. Women will say, women will stay because it's so hard to find help out there when you're not working and you've got kids. So you stay because, even though the partner's there, at least you have a house. And even though they still control the money, at least you still have a house. And it's not really security, but at least you feel like you've got something. I just kept, because I didn't have anything else. I was a loser. In my mind, I felt like I was a loser. I kept, because I felt like I was worthless. I didn't feel like I felt like I was just like trash. It takes a lot of strength to actually leave. The fear of leaving, the repercussions of leaving, a lot of people fear to leave. I don't know how, but somehow with a lot of help, I actually managed to get out.
Yeah. So I think we talked about all of those, but hearing it directly from a victim herself, I think is really quite powerful. I think the thing that we need to talk about is why it's so important to believe a woman when she talks about her experience of violence. What tips or advice would you give someone who wants to support a woman who's been in an abusive relationship? How would you think that might go?
I'm happy to answer that first. I think the most important message that you can give is that you will be there to hear their story as many times as they need, that you will support them, that you're there for them. Crucial for the victim to know that regardless of what choice they make, you will still be there as a friend. I think sometimes, a victim might think, oh, my friend wanted me to leave and I didn't, so I can't go back to that friend now because they're going to judge me. And what we know is, women who leave attempt to leave many times before they actually do.
Absolutely.
The most important thing as a support person is that they know that you are there unconditionally, that you're not going to judge them. If you don't have the capacity to do that, I don't know, maybe someone else in the panel might be able to answer to that, because that doesn't mean that you have the capacity to do that. People do get tired of hearing, oh, she's just gone back again and it's happened again, and, she obviously wants it to keep going because she doesn't leave. There are people who have that judgment. But if you want to be that support person, you need to be there unconditionally.
Patience was the first thing that popped into my head, and self-care, because you're going to be hearing things from a friend, from two people that you know and possibly are close to, that are quite disturbing. So know when to kind of also have a little bit of like, yes, this is what your friend's going through, but you don't have to be their shining armor, like, shining knight in armor or whatever.
You don't have to rescue them.
You don't have to rescue them, Your job could be simple as just listening to them whenever they talk to you and saying, what about ringing this number? Or, and if they go, blah, 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 they're not going to do it, bring it up again, But just be that person that they can share that information with. But yeah, you don't have to be their savior. And yeah, it could be a long haul kind of thing. Yeah.
At their pace, I think, is really important.
I think knowing you don't have to have the answers.
Yeah.
I think that's probably really important, because I think as humans we want to fix. That's a natural thing. We want to have the answers. We want to fix. We want to help. And I think this is one of those situations where you can't fix it, and you shouldn't try to fix it. So just accept that you can't fix it, and you don't have to have the answers. I think believe the story is the biggest. And don't offer your opinions about the perpetrator. I knew he was crap. I knew something was wrong. Because it might take several times before, and if she does go back and they're in that honeymoon period, then she may not come back to you for support, because then, you've shown your beliefs of that person, and she won't want to come to you and reinforce your opinions of that, of her partner. So believe, don't share your opinions, and don't try to fix it.
Yeah. And if you are listening to a story, you can also call the helplines yourself. You can call 1-800-RESPECT as a friend to offload, and they will listen, and they might be able to give you tips of what you can do to offer. They will give you simple things that you could do to support.
Absolutely.
Where your friend is at that moment. So don't feel like you're left alone in that space as well.
And you've got to have all the answers.
So just back again, listen, be non-judgmental, and be available to be that ear. And that's all you can. And where you can, I always try, people do come and, say to me, I've got this friend, da-da-da-da. And I'm always like, well, you can call the helplines as well. So try and lead them to at least 1-800-RESPECT to ring and just have a chat to someone who's trained. Is also just useful as well as being patient. Yeah.
I think one thing as well is being careful. Like, we've talked a lot about language and the way we talk about this problem, and just being mindful of the language you use just in day to day, because you have no idea what the person sitting next to you might be going through. And if you say something like, oh, why doesn't she leave, about some scenario, the person sitting next to you might be going through something similar. And if you talk about it in that negative way, that person's not going to open up to you. So I think just being mindful and being proactively educating yourself, so that if and when this comes up, you are prepared, because research shows that if victims have a negative response when they do share, and it could be the first time that they're entrusting someone with this hugely traumatic information about themselves, if it's not responded to the right way, they might never tell anyone else again, and the worst case scenario in that can be terrible.
So there are some key do points if you have a friend who's coming to disclose to you about violence. The biggest thing is create a safe environment, and I think we talked about that a bit, about not to be judgmental, watch our language, build trust and connection. And obviously, if they're your friend, you've built that a bit, so keep that going. Listen, validate. So yes, if they say yes, we believe you. Try your best to understand, or at least feel like you're understanding. Show that you're trying to be understanding. And I think we've mentioned this a few times. It can take a long time for your friend to leave if she does leave. So be patient with their story, and always be confidential, right? This is something highly private. She might feel ashamed, but there might be a risk of safety involved. So try to keep it to yourself. And if you really need to offload, there's always helplines that you can ring, and those you can talk to the helpline numbers as well. Just a bit of a rundown.
Thanks.
No worries.
Well, thanks for watching the session, and we look forward to you joining us for the next session.